All right. I assume this is on. Can you hear me? Good and loud? Oh, that sounds good. That's on. All right. So, as Dennis said, and thank you, Dennis, for that nice introduction. I'm glad to see a really nice turnout for this kind of an off-season lecture. It's good to see so many faces out there. And today I'm going to talk to you about what's going on in South Florida with harmful algal blooms. I know many of you are probably interested in the red tide that's currently happening off our coast, and I will concentrate a lot on that. But I'm going to tell you about all the other harmful algal blooms that are actually going on right now as well. Of course, it worked for a second. There it goes. Before I start, there are many, many people I need to thank. And this isn't even all of them. If you're not on this list and I left you off, I'm sorry. But many people have helped me with my research here, getting acclimated to understanding the ecosystems of the IRL in Florida, helped with promoting our research here at Harbor Branch, and even the local TV stations, one of which is actually back there. They help promote what we do. They give us publicity, and they get the message out to all of you. So I want to thank everyone who's been involved in helping us get the message of Harbor Branch and our research out to the public. Oh, and I also want to say a special thanks to the Harbor Branch Oceanographic Institute Foundation. They support a lot of the research that you're going to see here today. So what are harmful algal blooms? Most of you probably know. We usually call them HABS. Some people call them red tides. They're simply occurrences of phytoplankton that cause negative ecosystem and or human impacts. Now, as you can see from these different harmful algal blooms pictures I have up here, this is actually Florida red tide, Corynea brevis. This is from the St. Lucie estuary. This is Microcystis organosa, the cyanobacteria that's toxic. This is currently the brown tide going up in the northern IRL. This is not from Florida waters, but it shows you the brilliant red color you can actually get. And that's where that's where the name came from, red tide, is when we'd have these massive blooms and the water would turn like blood red. And most of these kind of red tides are from what we call dinoflagellates. This is not a dinoflagellate, nor is this. So there are different organisms that make these, and there's different colors. That's why most scientists do not use the term red tide anymore. It's an obsolete term. To me, when I hear it, I just think that's a dinoflagellate bloom. We use harmful algal blooms because it's a better term to describe it, because not all are red. So what are phytoplankton? Harmful algal blooms are composed of phytoplankton. For those of you who are not phytoplankton biologists, they're, in the simple form, microscopic plants, and we commonly call them algae. But these include photosynthetic bacteria, which are different from eukaryotic algae. And this is a typical dinoflagellate cell, one of the types of algae, one of the more common ones that causes harmful algal blooms. It's about 50 microns inside, which is about the width of your hair. And you can see, while it's a plant, it's not a simple plant. It's a protist. And it has characteristics of animals and plants. It can swim through the water column, and that's why a lot of times with dinoflagellates in particular, you'll see them aggregate at the surface. That's why you see that brilliant color, because the whole population is basically coming up to the surface. They swim up there to get light, and then at nighttime they tend to migrate back down through the water column to get nutrients that are deeper in the water. So how do these phytoplankton, or HABs, actually grow? They are basically simple plants, and they typically need three main conditions to grow or bloom into very large biomass. And what they need is optimal light, and higher light promotes faster growth, something to remember. They need an optimal temperature, and warmer temperatures actually promote faster growth. So remember that as well. And they also need optimal nutrients. They need the fuel to actually grow, just like your houseplant when you fertilize it. More nutrients equals more biomass. It means you can grow more of it. You can get more and more of the algal growth. And how are they actually harmful? There's a number of ways. Most people are familiar with that they can have toxins in them. That's the primary thing that most people think about. And there are a variety of different toxins that these organisms can make. And you need to know that when you're trying to understand your risk when you have a harmful algal bloom. But because there can be so much of it during a bloom, this high biomass, or just the amount of algae that's there, can cause hypoxia and anoxia. This is where the water column runs out of oxygen. So essentially any other animal in there is going to suffocate and die. And this happens because when that biomass sinks down and starts to rot, the bacteria that work on it have to respire, and they use oxygen, and they suck it all out of the water. The phytoplankton at night also do the same thing. They respire just like we do. They have to breathe, in other words, and they use up oxygen. And when the conditions are right, and you don't get a lot of wind mixing to get new oxygen into the water, the water column can become starved of oxygen and everything can die. We also have shading, and this is a problem here in the Indian River Lagoon. When you have a biomass like this sitting at the surface, and this is from the St. Lucie estuary with the cyanobacterial bloom, think about the plants, the seagrass that has to grow on the bottom of the lagoon. They're not going to get any light. All the light's being absorbed by this massive algae that are sitting on the surface. So essentially it starves the seagrass of light and the seagrass beds die. And this is a common thing that can happen in the Indian River Lagoon. They can also cause mechanical damage. So even if they're not toxic, they can actually hurt wildlife. A lot of these organisms produce mucus or surfactants that can affect biology. Mucus can clog the feeding apparatus of clams and other shellfish and make them basically starve to death. They can make surfactants that can affect seabirds and how they are insulated from the cold water. Some even have serrations on their cells. So their cells actually have sharp barbs on them that when they get into fish gills can cut up the fish gills and kill the fish. It's another way they can do it. The final way they're harmful, and this is a very obvious one to everyone here, is economics. Think about what's happening right now to tourism. People are not coming to Florida to swim in our green water. It is not going to happen. You're not going to go out and recreate in this, nor should you, for that matter. If you have property down by the water and you're constantly having a harmful algal bloom behind it, what do you think is going to happen to your property values? They're not going to be good. People on the West Coast are dealing with this right now. And obviously there's other effects from fisheries, toxins getting into fisheries and other things. But this is a big one for Florida right now, a really big one. So there are many different HAB toxins and effects, and this again is why you really need to know what's out there, and you need to know the different kind of organisms, because all these toxins are very different and do different things to you, just like they do different things to the animals that are out there. So there are algae, and a lot of these are dinoflagellates, but look at all the different toxins they produce, or the different types of responses. You can get paralytic shellfish poisoning, diuretic shellfish poisoning, neurotoxic shellfish poisoning. This is actually Karenia, the red tide here, amnesic shellfish poisoning, and also ciguatera fish poisoning. So there are a lot of different toxins that are out there. Now, there's a lot of different ways it can get into you. For freshwater algae, harmful algae, it can get into drinking water. If you take drinking water out of a freshwater lake and there's a large bloom of toxic algae, that toxin can get into the drinking water, and it has happened. It happened in Lake Erie with the Toledo water crisis. Lake Okeechobee has recurrent toxic algae blooms. It is a freshwater drinking source. I'm not saying there's any toxin in the drinking water, but it's always possible. If someone, for some reason, the water doesn't get treated correctly, toxins can get into the water. Algae can emit aerosolized toxin. This is exactly what you're all seeing on our beaches here right now. This is Karenia brevis, the red tide. The brevetoxin gets aerosolized, you breathe it, you start to cough, your eyes water. It's very unpleasant. These toxins, because phytoplankton are the base of the food chain. So phytoplankton are plants, they're grazed on by other little animals, which are eventually eaten by fish, which are eaten by larger fish, which go up the food chain all the way to us. So as these toxins get into the food chain, they can get into the fish and other things that we eat. So it goes trophic transfer of the toxins. And lastly, recreational exposure can make you sick. So if you're out there swimming in this water, and it's, a bad algae, you're going to get a higher exposure to this toxin. So there's times when you should not be recreating out in the water. I mean, how many people have had to change their recreation habits because of the red tide going on right now? Yeah, see, almost the entire place. But that's good. You should minimize your exposure to toxins. There's two ways the toxins can get at you, too. There's the acute impacts, and this is what you'd all understand. This is when you have an immediate and some kind of bad response to when you're exposed to the toxins. Just like when you go to the beach right now and you start coughing. That's just an acute response to the toxin. And we kind of understand this and we know it fairly well. This is what we don't know at all, or we know very little about. And what is the chronic impact? In other words, what's the long-term impact to your health? If you're exposed to these harmful algal blooms year after year at some low level, is it doing anything to you? We don't know. Is it seriously hurting you or not? We need a lot more research into what the chronic health impacts are to humans that are exposed to these, because guess what? We're all starting to get exposed to them a lot more. So Florida HABs right now are an ecological and economic crisis. We're living through it right now, and it just appears to be getting worse and worse. And these are not the headlines any of you here want to see. I just pulled these off from just this past 6 months. And some of these are, you know, this is CNN, USA Today. These are national stories. We're making national news right now. And just, you know, look at some of these headlines. The problem is, this is not going to go away anytime soon. Why do I say that? Worldwide, not just in Florida, HABs are increasing, you know, in different places. We're seeing them more often in different places, but also in the frequency, duration, and severity that they're out there. So this is not just isolated to us. Now, it's especially true for Florida, and I contend that Florida is one of the most impacted states in the U.S. right now. I've studied harmful algal blooms in different places. Our situation is incredibly unique, and it's pretty bad. And you can see here from this map, pre-1972, these are reported incidents of harmful algal blooms. This map's seriously out of date. It's 10 years out of date. It would look far worse if this was 2018. And you can see the difference just over this time period. So it's getting worse, and it's probably not going to stop anytime soon. Why are these things increasing? This would be your natural question. Why, you know, why is this happening? Most of you can probably guess why. One of the reasons, and this isn't really why it's increasing, but we do have better knowledge, we have better monitoring, and we're better at detecting these things. So we're out there, and we probably see some blooms that normally maybe we'd never know were there. So we do identify more of them, but that's not really the reason why we're seeing more of them. One of the biggest reasons is eutrophication, or what you simply would call nutrient pollution. A lot of nutrients from, you know, mankind are working their way into our watersheds and being washed into our oceans and our streams and our lakes. And that fertilizes the growth of these organisms. Human ecosystem modifications, we do a lot of land use practices. We can increase runoff. We're doing dredging. People like to live by the water, you know, and Florida's in a massive, not massive, but a pretty good development cycle right now. We start changing the local environment, it works differently. Water that used to be, you know, would maintain itself in the swamps or potentially in the Everglades or some other area is now shunted very quickly away from where homeowners are, and it gets into the lagoon, it gets out into the ocean. So just our runoff patterns are changing. Global warming and climate change is a very large issue. I don't know if we have any climate deniers in the audience, but regardless, it's getting warmer. We set records almost every year for ocean temperature rise and land temperature rise. The problem with this is that this warming of our globe and warming of our water, it increases the ranges of where these algae can go. So if they like warm water, they can't bloom up in New England, or they can only during a very small time in the summer. But as the water starts warming, we get further and further north with warm water, and it maintains itself longer during the year. Things that could grow only in the Caribbean or only near the equator can now start growing in our water. So it's kind of like an invasive plant that couldn't make it through a winter. But if the winter goes away, that plant can stay around. Not only does the warming increase the range of these organisms, so we'll see maybe things that we normally wouldn't see here, as I said earlier, it increases their growth rates most of the time. So as it gets warmer, they grow faster. Also with climate change comes changing precipitation. It's a known reaction where you get patterns of drought and runoff, and both of these can affect how much nutrients get runoff into our environment. Sometimes hypersalinity from drought can cause different algae to bloom. So it's another issue. The last two are not as well defined, and we don't look at them as major causes, but they have happened. We introduced some of these new harmful algal bloom species into new environments, and this has happened through ballast water transport. Our big ocean-going liners that, you know, transport cars and oil and all that, they need to take on ballast water in one port. They go across the oceans and they discharge that ballast water again. Well, the algae that they suck in from one place, let's say China, can then survive the trip across the ocean, and when they get over here and they discharge that water, the algae that were in there they've been introduced in an area they never should have been in. This was a bigger problem probably in the 70s and 80s till people started to recognize it was happening. So now they try to treat and sterilize ballast water as much as they can. And also a change in the primary grazers. A grazer is something that basically eats something else, like a cow eating grass. Well, there are a lot of things that eat harmful algal blooms. Zooplankton and other crustaceans will eat them. But if we start to change the environment and the natural predators of these algae are no longer there, well, guess what? They're going to grow out of control, and we're going to have a problem. So let's get to the actual HABs in South Florida. I just made this map a little while ago. It is really, sorry for it, looks kind of confusing. What I'm trying to do here is circle different harmful algal bloom events that have basically happened this year or last year. And a lot of these are ongoing right now. You see two really big circles on the west coast and now on the east coast. This is Karenia. This is the red tide that's currently going on both coasts. But the important thing to take from this, it's not the only thing going on there. It gets a lot of publicity, but there are a lot of other blooms going on right now that are potentially more dangerous than red tide. The microcystis bloom, the cyanobacteria that produces microcystin that grows in Lake Okeechobee and can get discharged to both sides of the coast, is currently going on. We had another bad year this year. Down in Florida Bay, we have a persistent bloom of cyanobacteria, which is not a freshwater cyanobacteria, but a saltwater cyanobacteria. Ciguatera, gambardiscus dinoflagellates grow in the Caribbean, and you can find them in the Keys. Up in northern IRL, we have the brown tide. This is AUREOUMBRA. It's not toxic. Up in the Banana River and the northern IRL, we have persistent blooms of pyridinium. This is another red tide organism. It's a dinoflagellate, if you want to put a name on it. It produces a toxin called saxitoxin. We're also starting to see toxic pseudonychia in the lagoon. Last year, we actually measured domoic acid in the lagoon, I think probably for the first time. This is a really dangerous neurotoxin. But you start to get the sense that we shouldn't just be worried about these two. There's a lot more going on. So let's talk about the red tide. I know most of you here probably want to hear about it, so I put some slides together just to try to inform you on it. So the Florida red tide is a dinoflagellate. It's one of those organisms like that movie I showed you. It can swim. It's modal, so it has a flagella. It produces brevetoxin, which is a neurotoxin, and this is a recurrent problem on the West Coast, but now obviously it happened here. We have had blooms of this before here. In 2007, there was a pretty significant bloom, so over 10 years ago. In humans, it gives you nausea, vomiting, numbness, respiratory distress. Everyone here that raised their hand before probably experienced some form of this. In marine life, it causes widespread death. That's why you're seeing fish being picked up everywhere. So it'll kill the things that are in the water with it. So what is the history of this bloom? So I pulled, FWC does a great job. They do a lot of monitoring. They do cell counts for Karenia. And I pulled the history, and I tried to put these big things on here because you probably can't read these little inscriptions of where it's from. But back in April of 2017, if you can see all these little dots, they're color-coded for how much algae that represents. So if they're white or gray, it essentially means there's almost nothing there, just background concentrations of the algae. Once they go to yellow to red, red being the worst, that means there's a lot of it. And when it's red, that's bad. So in April of last year, it essentially was not on the West Coast at all. You know, just normal background amounts. By December, right when we're about to turn into the new year of 2018, it started showing up around the Tampa Bay area. Not incredibly high. It's still yellow and orange, but it is starting to show up in one area. By June, it's still not bad. It's still there, but it's starting to spread out spatially along the coast. By July, now remember the water's getting warmer. We're heading towards summer. We see higher concentrations. We're starting to see reds, and it's still spreading out. By August, it's bad. It's now high everywhere, and that's where you saw on the news. This was making national news a lot. They had massive fish kills over there in August, and you can see why. It got really, really bad. Last month, in September, it's still bad, but it's waning a little bit, nothing like it was there. So now we get into October, this October. So this is just a couple weeks ago. It's still on the West Coast. Notice there's some down in the Florida Keys. That's new. Didn't show up down there before. And now we see it down in Broward and Palm Beach. Not up here yet, but in the beginning of October, we saw it down in the southern counties on the East Coast. How can this Karenia brevis get to the East Coast? That's the first question everyone wanted to know. So remember, it's down in the Keys. This is what the general currents look like in the Gulf of Mexico and around Florida. We have what's called the loop current. which goes around the Gulf of Mexico. It eventually goes around and becomes the Florida current, which is right around the Keys, south of the Keys, which then curls around the east coast of Florida and becomes the Gulf Stream, which runs all the way up the east coast. If the harmful algal bloom, or the Karenia, is down here, it can easily get swept into the Florida current and get transported up to our coast, which is exactly what we think happened. It's our best hypothesis. When you add onshore winds now, if you have this population that's getting pulled up here, and you have consistent onshore winds, guess what? We're blowing it right up onto our coast. So instead of staying out kind of offshore on the Gulf Stream, it's coming in. And right before this started, we had like 10 days of pretty strong onshore winds. And we still are having onshore winds, actually. So this is how it gets over here and how it gets blown over into our coast, to the best of our knowledge. So if we look at what happened, and we can kind of watch that progression as it went up the coast with the current, FWC has these really nice maps. I encourage you to go onto their website if you want to know the status of it. They put, pretty easy to see graphics. What this graph shows is if it's blue, light blue, or gray, or blue or light blue, that was a positive change. In other words, there was less of it there. So they found less of it there. When you start to see yellow to red, that means, oh, it's increasing in that area off that coast. So you can see it was down in Palm Beach and down in here. But then it moved out of here once we started getting to mid-October, and then we started to see it up into St. Lucie County and Martin County. And then once we got into just about a week ago, we started seeing it off Indian River County and Sebastian and getting up into Melbourne and going up further. So it's making the progression from coming around and basically getting up into here. And if we look at now this map, this weekly change map from the 13th, just a few days ago, we now see red. That's bad. That means it's increased in our water. And it's almost disappearing down in the south area. So we watched it progress and move up the coast. So we can look at that count data, but it's much more informative to look at remote sensing. So we can look at our waters with satellites, which give us a pretty good picture of where the algae are. So this is an image of the southern part of Florida. Here are the Keys. Sorry, the satellite's this is a native satellite image, so it's a little skewed. But the color is the same. If it's red, it's a lot of algae. If it goes to green, it's less. When it's blue, it's essentially clear water. And this is what's called a chlorophyll index. It's how much chlorophyll is in the water. Chlorophyll is a pigment that all algae have. So this doesn't tell you this is definitely Karenia, but if you know there's a lot of this red tide out there, most of it is that. That's what you're seeing. And you can see now, this came from October 14th. If we blow it up, this is the Indian River Lagoon, and this is the offshore water. You can see all the algae that's actually sitting out there now. And you can actually see this red spot pretty much right off right off Vero. And Vero is some of the highest counts we were finding in our lab and where FWC also found it. So you can actually see it from space. This blob of high concentration of Karenia is actually sitting there. But you can see it's pretty widespread over the area. And if we look at from October 14th, so just 2 days ago, we can look at these images and we can start to understand how it changed and how it's moving a lot better than just taking static counts that we get from FWC. The black areas where you can't see, these are clouds. When the satellite's going over, it can't see through clouds. So it has to have a clear day. And you can see, here's this blob here. Oh, it wasn't so bad. Just a day later, and this is this patchiness you're getting. I mean, some of you have probably noticed you'll go down one day, it won't be that bad. You go back the next day, all of a sudden you're coughing again. So it's kind of moving around, and it's kind of at the whim of the winds and how the currents move as well. And you can see after a few days, a big blob got shunted offshore or was possibly growing out there. But we should be able to post-mortem take all this data and just animate how it moved. It'll tell us a lot about the science, or whether or not we thought it was actually growing here, or if it was just transported here and faded away. I should mention this came from the Sentinel-3 satellite. This is actually from the European Space Agency. It's not one of NASA's satellite. And all these images were processed actually this morning for me by one of my colleagues, Dr. Tim Moore. So I'm going to just get into some really quick questions. These are questions I've been asked by the media and asked by the public. Will the red tide get into the lagoon and will it bloom? Will it act like a seed population? And should we worry about it actually taking over the lagoon and not staying out? Well, we can look at some counts from the FWC. We've done similar counts in the lagoon as well. And you can look at the 3 inlets. And you can see the spots that they take it off the beach, but you can also see people are counting it in the actual lagoon. Now, there is no way, if we have the bloom right in front of an inlet and it's an incoming tide, it has to get in the lagoon. It's an impossibility for it not to. But what we'd expect is you'd see a little bit of it in there, but it wouldn't really spread. And, hopefully it won't ever get high. So we do, in fact, see it getting in around the inlets. These are the inlets there. You can see it there, you can see it there, and you can see some there. But it's not spreading out really far. My hope would be, given that this organism does occur naturally in the Indian River Lagoon, we do see it there. It's not like it only comes over from the West Coast. I don't know if it's ever been reported to actually bloom in the lagoon. The ecological conditions in our lagoon are probably not favorable for this thing to start a second bloom inside the lagoon. So let's cross our fingers that it'll just fade away when it gets in there and it will not start a bloom. And I would guess that probably is the case, or we most likely would have seen a bloom at some point in the past. So this is the second one, and everyone speculates on this. How much longer is it going to last over here? I'm sure everyone wants to know. So on Monday, and unfortunately we've been in this pattern, these are wind patterns for the state of Florida. And you can see we have this onshore wind. It's just going to keep it against our coast. And that was Monday. Wednesday, today, we're actually starting to see a bit of a southern component, so it may start blowing some back down a little bit further south. And Thursday, again, tomorrow, we're supposed to see some pretty strong onshore winds. That's not good. It's not going to go away if it's being piled into our shore. The great thing is, and let's hope this forecast holds up, Hurricane Willa just hit Mexico yesterday. It's coming across the southern tier of the states. When it comes across the south here, it's going to create, hopefully, if the forecast holds, very strong offshore winds. This should pull this water that's in here offshore. It might get entrained in the Gulf Stream and get blown out of here. If we have a good blow, this is where the remnants of a hurricane are actually going to help us. So it may push this offshore. So again, cross your fingers. So it's possible it could be out of here by Sunday, or not. But, we'll hope. But at least it's finally a switch in the wind direction. So I'm going to go back to this. That was depressing enough, but this is the thing. Unfortunately, the Florida red tide is not the only HAB problem we have. I already showed you this and described to you. We get a lot of other issues out there. And I just found this out, that Moat Marine just got a $1 million donation, a philanthropic donation from a foundation to start the Red Tide Institute on that coast. And I want to say this. If there's any millionaires out there, I would love some money. But, and very seriously, red tide is really well studied in the state of Florida. I just showed you a bunch of maps that anyone can pull down anytime. We know where it is. We have predictive algorithms for it. We pretty much know a lot about it. What we don't know about are all these other things. So state supports a ton of money into moat and different things to support red tide research. We don't get the love for all these other problems we have, and we really need it. And, when I see this, it kind of makes me, not that it's a bad thing, but it makes me angry that we're not doing more on this coast for the problems that we have. It's like red tide gets a lot of headlines, but it may not be the worst thing we have out there. So remember that. And if you win the lottery, please come see me. So I'm going to go through a few of these just to explain to you what's going on in a little bit more detail. So down in the Caribbean and into the Keys, and this may start happening further and further north, is the ciguatera dinoflagellate called gambardiscus. It's again a dinoflagellate, like the Carenia red tide and pyridinium. It can swim, but it tends to be epiphytic on seagrass. So fish that eat seagrass, they're eating it, they're swallowing this dinoflagellate and they're getting the toxin in them. And then as other predators eat them, this gambardiscus toxin gets into them, and if you eat a fish, one of these larger fish, you're going to get ciguatera, which, has anyone here had ciguatera? It's pretty common if you live in the Caribbean. Barracuda is supposed to be especially dangerous to eat, just because it tends to have a lot of it. So we're seeing it, and we have always seen it, and the Miami Herald contended that it's actually a lot more prevalent than we actually know. And if you get ciguatera, you're going to have nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, muscle pain, potentially hallucinations. It will not kill you, most likely. Not a pleasant day, though, after you eat. Another issue that's happening in Florida Bay right now is that we're having these consistent blooms of a saltwater cyanobacteria called Synechococcus, and some other picoplankton are actually, and these are growing with it too, and these are really small algae. But this is what Florida Bay can actually look like. And this can cause anoxia and hypoxia, fish kills, seagrass loss. You get enough of it, it's going to kill the coral too, because the coral aren't going to get the light they need with their symbiotic algae. Whether they have produced cyanotoxins, they are a cyanobacteria, is subject of debate. There's not a lot of study on studying marine cyanobacteria for toxins, but they are cyanobacteria, so you never know. And unfortunately, this is what we're seeing down there. Some of it's due to hypersalinity potentially, but some of it's due to the amount of nutrients that we're pumping into the south. Now I'm going to go through what's going on just in our backyard in the IRL. So here's a map of the IRL. I told you a little bit about this. This is the brown tide. It's continually going on right now. It is not toxic, so it's a species called AUREOUMBRA. It does cause hypoxia and anoxia. It does create fish kills, and it does kill the seagrass. This pyridinium species in the Banana River and the northern IRL is pretty much happens every summer up there. It's a red tide. It's a dinoflagellate, so we call it a red tide. It produces a different toxin than Florida red tide called saxitoxin, which is a really bad neurotoxin. It can give you paralytic shellfish poisoning. We have also noticed pseudonychia starting to occur more and more in the lagoon. Last year, we actually measured domoic acid in the lagoon, which is another neurotoxin and can give you amnesic shellfish poisoning. Also, a little bit south of the brown tide, there's been this consistent bloom of cyanobacteria and other picoplankton. This is very similar to what happens in Florida Bay. So they're not toxic, but there's a lot of them there, and if the conditions are right, they can get really big. How many people remember the super bloom, 2011? Do you? That's what it was. Non-toxic algae, but it still devastated the seagrass beds up there. I talked about this, the microcystis. This is the green tide, we call it. It turns the water green. These produce microcystins. These are really bad hepatotoxins. They can destroy your liver. Some people contend they can give you neurological damage. These can also do hypoxia, anoxia, fish kills, and seagrass loss. And finally, we'll add the Karenia on there just for good measure. That's happening right now too. So there's a lot going on in our lagoon right now. So the AUREOUMBRA brown tide, this started in 2012. This has been going on for a lot of years. Didn't just start yesterday. It's been going on for a long time. In 2016, this is what the area up by the Mosquito Lagoon looked like. It's brown water. It looks like coffee. If you looked at it under a microscope, these are all the individual cells of AUREOUMBRA. They're very small, and that's just what it looks like if you put the water right under a microscope. Just in June of this year, it looked exactly the same. It's essentially at the same density it was in 2016. Still growing. In 2016, how many people remember this? We had one of the worst fish kills we've ever had up in the northern Indian River Lagoon. This is what the canals look like. It was devastating. If the conditions turn right, this could happen again. The algae is still there. The algae is still growing. This particular algae has occurred before in a system like the IRL. In Laguna Madre, Texas, they had a bloom of AUREOUMBRA as well. It lasted over a decade. Did not go away for over 10 years. I talked a little bit about this. This is this pyridinium organism. It is a summertime bloom in the northern Indian River Lagoon and Banana River since the mid-90s. So around 97, it's pretty much been happening every year. It produces a saxitoxin, which can give you a paralytic shellfish poisoning. So much so that there's a permanent prohibition on taking pufferfish out of the lagoon because it harbors this saxitoxin in it. And people were eating it, I think, back in the 80s, and they were getting very, very sick. Last year, we found a really strong bloom. It might have been the strongest bloom we've seen yet. So this may be increasing as well. A lot of cells, and they were spread out over a pretty large area. We measured at times between 3 and 8 milligrams per liter of saxitoxin in the water, which for most of you means nothing. You don't know what that means, so I'll explain to you what it potentially could mean. So again, we measured between 3 and 8 micrograms per liter of this toxin in the water. If Florida actually had regulatory rules for saxitoxin, which we currently don't, this may have happened. So these are states that do. This is from the EPA. This happens to be Ohio. When you have saxitoxin over 3 micrograms per liter, and that's what we were measuring, actually higher than that, it's do not use. Recreational, no contact. You shouldn't be in the water at all. So Ohio would close the Banana River down if we had the same rules. I've showed this before. Some of you have probably seen it, and I find this very ironic. But I see this article almost every single year since I've been down here, and it's a bucket list thing you can do for Florida, authentic Florida. This is like a tourism thing that you should do, and it's to look at the bioluminescence in the Banana River, which happens every summer, okay? So it's recurrent, so much so that someone started a business around it, okay? Pyridinium is a species that creates this bioluminescence. Pyridinium is very toxic. Lots of bioluminescence, lots of toxin. So maybe this is how we're going to make money off red tides. I don't know. But this is bizarre that we're promoting something that we should be telling people to stay out of the water, and we're telling them to go frolic in it. It's odd. This is one that most of the people that are from Martin County are probably very familiar with, and most of you probably are. This is the microcystis HABs that occur in Lake Okeechobee. So we get these really large-scale blooms. I mean, this is Lake Okeechobee from space. Lake Okeechobee is a big lake, if you haven't been out there. And these occur regularly during the warmer months. Again, it likes warm weather. So May to November, it's pretty much out there. And this is a shot from space. All these green slicks, that's the bloom of microcystis out there. It can dominate like 80, 90% of the lake surface. Microcystin produces this hepatotoxin, microcystin, which can cause liver damage and other problems. These negative effects of the cyanobacteria are not restricted to Lake Okeechobee, as I think you probably all know now, because the lake discharge currently is to the east and west coast, the Caloosahatchee River and C-44. You know, this is the historic flow of Lake Okeechobee. This is what it currently looks like. The one interesting thing is, just yesterday, I don't know if any of you saw it, but the president actually signed and authorized the U.S. Corps of Engineers to begin work on the massive reservoir south of Lake Okeechobee. And it's designed to clean and store more water, so they're going to send less of it to our coast. That's great. It'll probably stop what's going on here. I fear for what's going, and it's going to take a long time, so it's not going away to build this. You know, I do have some fear for what it's going to do if a lot of this water does start naturally going back south. We're already sending nutrients south into Florida Bay from the Everglades system. If we increase that current bloom problem we have down there, it could get worse. So I hope it doesn't happen, but we could be moving a problem from one area to another. So as I said, these big blooms get transported through C-44 into the St. Lucie estuary in the Indian River Lagoon, and then you start to see signs like this. Avoid contact with the water. Don't go in water that looks green like this. You laugh about it, but some people do. So the problem is these cyanobacteria blooms are not just causing an economic and environmental damage. I mean, we know that's happening. But it is possible that there's a direct human cost. So this study came out in 2016. And it looked at part of a cluster of non-alcoholic liver disease and these algal blooms. And 4 counties along the Treasure Coast make up this cluster, the only one in the state, with high rates of deaths from this non-alcoholic liver disease and correlated to where the algal blooms are. The 4 counties are Indian River, Martin, St. Lucie, and Okeechobee. Most of you probably live in one of these counties. So consider that. This happened. I just pulled this. We had people that their pets go into the water or they jumped away and got in the water. And a couple of them got very sick, dogs, because, you know, dogs like to play in the water. They'll drink the water. They're drinking this microcystin, which will, you know, very much hurt their livers. I think there was 1 or 2 fatalities of dogs that were proven that they died of acute liver failure from exposure to the toxins. You know, and I'm not saying correlation is causation. It's possible this study's not right and no one has died from this or had their health impacted, but we don't know. We don't know. And that's why we need more research, because we don't know. What we have started here, and we just started this in August, is the Florida Center for Coastal and Human Health. And what we want to do with this is using all the expertise with the great researchers we have here and strategic partners and other scientists we can recruit, collaborate, and do the best job we can to start understanding this HAB crisis and start trying to come up with solutions, or at least understanding our risk better to our health. This is a big deal. We need to understand what the health impacts for all of you are if you're out playing in the water or living here. You should know your risk. Whether you want to take that risk, then it's up to you. Eventually, if we're successful, we can turn this and end up with a healthy environment and a healthier population. So we don't have people potentially getting sick from these things. What we're trying to do right now, I'm doing this very hard, is trying to recruit our stakeholders and strategic partners to actually help us. And I've dealt with all these different groups already. Most of them are agreeing to try to collaborate and work together. But we have to start doing the very critical research that needs to be done. We need to respond to this crisis when it's happening. We can't wait a year when we can get funding. So we're already doing quite a bit. You can see some of these headlines. Most of you probably, or some of you probably saw that we put a sea prism out in Lake Okeechobee to monitor the cyanobacterial blooms out there. We're working with FIT to look at how these toxins are potentially getting into dolphins, which we consider a sentinel species for humans. Spencer Fire is here somewhere. He's actually working directly with him. He's from FIT. We're also looking at how nutrients are contributing to the growth of this, and through our Indian River Lagoon Observatory, we're out there making real-time water quality measurements at the same time so we can correlate that to some of the science we're doing. But also, very importantly, we're, I think, the only group in the state of Florida currently doing this, which is incredibly surprising. But we're starting to test people for how much toxin is actually in them. Looking for volunteers, taking blood, urine, and nasal swab samples to find out, do you have toxin in your body if you were occupationally or recreationally exposed to these? This is really important work, really, really important work. So what can you do? It's an election year. You all know this. Use the power that you have. If this upsets you and you want to see the state and federal government take action, talk to your representatives, talk to your senators, talk to your county commissioners, and say you want to see them take action. This is when we have the power and can get the political will to do something. And I urge you all to use that power. Vote. But also, write a letter. Complain to them. It makes a difference. It really does. And please, don't forget about this problem in a month, because you know what's going to happen, and I've seen it now for 3 years since I've been here. Winter is going to come, the temperature is going to cool off, the blooms are going to go away, and everyone's going to pretend this did not happen. Until next year, when it happens again, and everyone starts screaming, tell us what to do, tell us what our risk is. Don't give up. You have to keep supporting this. You have to keep fighting for the state and the federal government to support this and change it. Don't forget, because everyone does. It's happened every single year I've been here. I can get on TV every day of the week if I want to talk about harmful algal blooms during this time of year. During January and February, no one wants to talk to me. So it's the way it is. The last is, we need a lot of research and a lot of critical research, but research is really expensive. It takes a lot of time and a lot of effort by people. And we do need money for science. So much so that we want to react right away to this, this happening, and we want to test people for toxins. The way grant cycles work, if you try to get funding, I put in a grant, let's say last month. I'm not going to see the funding for at least a year. I can't wait a year. I've got to deal with it now. People are being critically exposed. We have to start going out and begging for money to actually just buy supplies. So we did a Springboard. This is FAU Springboard site, which is like Kickstarter, or a GoFundMe page, where we're literally just asking for $10,000 to buy supplies so we can test people and do this. And I've donated money out of my own pocket to try to do this science, because that's what we need to do. We're also working with the company 4Ocean to raise money to start understanding what's going on in Lake Okeechobee better. These are still up there. If you feel like you want to donate, great, donate. But if you can't, if money's not your thing, that's fine. It's still an election year. You can talk to your representatives, and you can force the issue. And again, if anyone's a millionaire and you win the lottery, please talk to me. You need money. Okay, so thanks.